welcome to History Club for the month of December. Today we have a very special holiday presentation for you, so stay tuned. So today we're talking about holiday music history, and this is the stories behind some of the songs we love, some of the Christmas songs, and also we have a Hanukkah song for you too, and that's what we're going to start out with. So the first song we're going to cover today is I Have a Little Dreidel. We're going to look at the history behind this song. And I Have a Little Dreidel is a song that recognizes the celebration of Hanukkah. So if you don't know what Hanukkah is, we're going to go over the history of it real quick so that we know what we're talking about here. So it starts out with Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great lived in the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Alexander the Great conquered not only Greece, but the Middle East, and the countries that are now Syria and Israel. Those were part of his empire. So after he died, his empire got divided up among his generals, and the faction that came to control the countries that are now Syria and Israel were called the Seleucids. So in the line of the Seleucids, there was a good king called Antiochus III who was very tolerant of the Jews who lived in Israel. He didn't try to force the Greek religion onto them, which the Seleucids followed the Greek religion. But now his son Antiochus IV was not so tolerant. So Antiochus IV actually banned Judaism and the teaching of Judaism, and he desecrated the temple by trying to turn it from a Jewish temple into a Greek temple and offering sacrifices to the Greek gods there. Now you may be thinking, well, didn't the Jews do anything? Didn't they fight back? And yes, they did. So one of the Jewish rabbis or teachers was a man named Matthias, and he actually taught anyway, and he led a rebellion against Antiochus IV. And when Matthias died, his son took over the rebellion, and his son's name was Judas Maccabees. Judas Maccabees is the main person that is celebrated at Hanukkah. Judas Maccabees led the revolt against the Seleucids, and he would have to use sneak attacks and surprise tactics because the Seleucids had a much bigger army than he did. But in spite of the fact that he had a smaller army, Judas Maccabees was victorious. It was a real underdog story. But what followed was equally as remarkable. So when the temple was rededicated after Judas Maccabees' victory, they only had enough oil for 1 day of light to light the candles of the menorah. And the menorah is what we see here. It's the candlestick holder there. But even though they only had enough oil for 1 day, the oil ended up lasting for 8 days. They had 8 days of light. It was a great miracle, and it's part of what Hanukkah celebrates. So one of the things people do at Hanukkah is they play the Dreidel game. So there's a legend about the Dreidel game that back when the Jews would teach their religion in secret, they would hide out in caves to do that. But when the Seleucids would show up, they would start playing Dreidel and be like, hey, nothing's going on here, just playing a nice friendly game of Dreidel. Now the Dreidel game probably actually came from Ireland and spread to Germany and Eastern Europe, and that's probably where it actually came from. But it does have meaning as far as Hanukkah goes. So you see these letters here, and they each have a different word associated with them. Shin, He, Gimel, and Nun, which means put in, half, all, and none. So the way the game is played is everybody puts what they're playing for into a pot. If you land on Shin, you have to put some more into the pot. If you land on He, you get half of it. If you land on Gimel, you get all of it. And if you land on Nun, you don't get anything. But the way it relates back to the miracle of Hanukkah is that when you put these letters together, they actually symbolize the sentence, "A great miracle happened there," referring to the great miracle that happened in the temple. The music for the song, "I Have a Little Dreidel, I Made It Out of Clay," that actually comes from an American, believe it or not. His name was Samuel E. Goldfarb. So he wrote the music. And so now you know about the holiday of Hanukkah, where it comes from, and where the song "I Have a Little Dreidel" comes from. So now we're going to talk about the song "Good King Wenceslas." You know, good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen. So Wenceslas I ruled Bohemia, which is in the modern day country of the Czech Republic. So Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. So since Bohemia was part of a bigger empire, Wenceslas's title during his life would have been more like Grand Duke or High Prince, not necessarily a king like we think of a king today. So Wenceslas's grandparents were the first Christian rulers of Bohemia, and he was actually raised by his Christian grandmother rather than his pagan mother. And he was born around 907 AD, and he became the ruler in the 920s. And it was a very split kingdom at the time between the Christians and the pagans. And like I said, even though Wenceslas had a Christian grandmother who raised him, he had a pagan mother. So you could see how split the kingdom was at the time. So Wenceslas was known for spreading Christianity throughout the kingdom, and he also gained a reputation for his generosity. He became a very popular king, and a lot of people loved and looked up to Wenceslas. But there were still some pagan factions, including among some of the nobles, that didn't like the fact that it was becoming a Christian kingdom, and they conspired with Wenceslas's brother, who was called Boleslav, to kill him. So like if you've seen The Lion King, you know how Scar kills Mufasa to become the king. Well, it was the same thing with King Wenceslas. So one day when he was at church, while he was at the church door, his brother came up to him and stabbed him along with some of his brother's friends. So these are pictures interpreting the song. The song is about Wenceslas providing a feast for a peasant, which that's just a story someone made up, but it goes along with the fact that he was generous. And so you see here he has a long white beard. Well, Wenceslas was actually killed when he was still in his mid to late 20s, so he probably wouldn't have had a long white beard at that point. After Wenceslas's death, he was made a king and a saint by the Pope posthumously, so after he had died. The song Good King Wenceslas comes to us because the words were written as a poem by John Mason Neal in 1853, and it's set to a medieval tune that is a traditional tune, and it actually celebrates not so much Christmas itself as St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, when Christians recognize the very first martyr, which is the very first Christian to die for their faith, who was Saint Stephen. And Saint Wenceslas actually has his own day, which is nowhere near Christmas. It's the day he died. It is September the 28th. So now you know the history of King Wenceslas. Okay, so now we're going to do We Wish You a Merry Christmas. I'm sure you all know this one and have heard it before. So it's a traditional song and its exact origin is unknown. So a lot of times when people celebrated Christmas back in the day, some people felt the celebrations got a little too rowdy. So why do we use the term Merry Christmas instead of Happy Christmas? Well, it's because Merry actually has a little bit more of a rowdy sort of sense behind it. There were actually some who thought the celebrations were too rowdy, and some people didn't celebrate Christmas. Even the Puritans thought it was too much of a Catholic thing and it had too many pagan origins. So there were some people who still loved celebrating Christmas, and you had people singing Christmas carols, which could be religious or they could be secular, and a lot of people used them to annoy the upper class. A lot of the more poor people would go into the richer neighborhoods and they would be singing these Christmas songs really loud, really late at night or really early in the morning, and they would say, "Hey, you want us to stop? You better bring us a tasty treat." So it's sort of like Halloween, you say trick or treat, you want to get a treat, you don't want to play a trick. It was sort of like that. So now what is figgy pudding anyway? So figgy pudding is actually not figgy, and it's actually not pudding either. It gets its name because back then figs were a word for dried fruit. It could be any dried fruit. And because pudding was just another word for dessert back then, it wasn't one specific kind of dessert. So it's actually a traditional cake made with raisins is what figgy pudding is. And we've got a picture right here if you want to see. Looks good, doesn't it? So there's actually some Christian symbolism in the dessert. So there are 13 ingredients that go into a figgy pudding, and that's used to represent Jesus plus the 12 apostles, and it's actually set on fire while you're preparing it. So that sort of symbolizes the death of Jesus. It serves as a reminder of that. And so now you know about the history of We Wish You a Merry Christmas. Now let's talk about Jingle Bells. So Jingle Bells was written by James Lord Pierpont in 1857. So that's a picture of him right there. So James Lord Pierpont has a very famous nephew. His nephew was J.P. Morgan, which stands for John Pierpont Morgan. So that's where the Pierpont comes from. It was his sister married a Mr. Morgan, and they had J.P. Morgan. So have you ever heard of J.P. Morgan? He was a very famous financier back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So he was a very wealthy and rich man. So James Lord Pierpont had a dad and brother who were Unitarian ministers. And James sort of did a little bit of everything. So he started out working on a whaling ship, like in Moby Dick, the famous book Moby Dick. He was a whaler. Then he went out to California to look for gold when there was a gold rush there. And finally, what he ended up becoming was he went to his brother's church down in Savannah, Georgia, and he became the church organist for that church. James Pierpont had ties to the city of Savannah then because he ended up marrying the mayor's daughter. So during the Civil War, His dad and brother were Union supporters. His brother left to go back to Massachusetts, where James was from. And his dad was actually a chaplain in the Union Army, but James actually served in the Confederate Army. Now, there's a lot of questions about the song Jingle Bells. For example, did James write it when he was in Massachusetts because he went back to Massachusetts for a little while after he was in California, or did he write it when he was in Georgia after he had already made the move? You can tell that he was thinking of Massachusetts and not Georgia in the song because it gets a lot more snowy up there, but we don't know where he actually wrote it at. In two places, one in Massachusetts and one in Georgia, actually claim that he wrote the song there. We also don't know if he wrote it for the church or for a theater. We know that there was a singing group for a theater that he let them perform it, but there's also reports that some of the people at his church sang it. Even though the song doesn't really have anything to do with church or religion, and the later verses of the song are actually about like taking your girlfriend sledding and seeing how fast you can go, and one song's even about the sleigh tipping over. So it doesn't seem like much of a church song, but it was reportedly sang in a church too. The original title was One Horse Open Sleigh, so oh what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. That was the original title, but it ended up getting changed to Jingle Bells later on. And it was probably originally written for Thanksgiving rather than Christmas, where it's just starting to get a little colder. It doesn't actually mention any holiday in the song. And you know, the song Over the River and Through the Wood to Grandmother's House We Go, that was written for Thanksgiving as well. It ended up becoming the first song broadcast from space when astronauts sang it from space in 1965. So now we know about Jingle Bells. So next, let's learn about the song White Christmas. This song was written by a man named Irving Berlin. You can see him right there in the early 1940s. So Berlin was a Russian immigrant and he was Jewish, so he would actually celebrated Hanukkah rather than Christmas. Or if he did celebrate Christmas, it would be in a secular way. So Berlin actually had a sad event happen to him on Christmas because his son died on Christmas in 1928. So probably the most famous singer back in the early 1940s was a man named Bing Crosby, and he sang this song on a holiday radio show. So you can see a picture of Bing Crosby right there. So the song became a big hit for Bing Crosby. In fact, it's the best-selling holiday song of all time. And Bing Crosby ended up including it in his movies. The first one was Holiday Inn, around the same time that he released his version. And then several years later, he made a movie named after the song called White Christmas. And that's a picture of Bing in that movie right there with his co-stars. So one of the reasons why White Christmas was so popular, because what was going on in 1942? World War II was going on. So the song brought up good Christmas memories for a lot of soldiers overseas. And another one of Bing Crosby's hits was I'll Be Home for Christmas, which was written specifically from the point of view of a soldier overseas who thought about going home for Christmas. The famous last line is, I'll be home for Christmas if only in my dreams. And so both of these songs were very popular with World War II soldiers, and so they're very popular even still today. They have that kind of a legacy. So now let's talk about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer didn't actually start off as a song. It started out as a children's book by Robert L. May. So you can see Robert L. May reading this book to his daughter there in this picture. Robert May worked for a company called Montgomery Ward. And Montgomery Ward would sell things during Christmas time, and they would give their customers little coloring books and children's books for the kids to take home with them as an extra incentive for coming to buy with them. And so Montgomery Ward had the idea, why don't we make our own children's book? And they put Robert May in charge of doing that. He was in the advertising department, and they thought he's a very creative guy, and he was the perfect choice because May had actually been teased as a kid growing up because he was smaller and less athletic than the other kids were. And one of his favorite books growing up was The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen. So you can see that there. It's about how a duckling grew up to be a swan. So it's sort of an underdog story. So Robert May added that element to his song. Now there's another thing about Robert L. May at the time that may make it seem like he wasn't the perfect candidate for writing this story, which was that he was in debt and that his wife was dying of cancer. So you think, well, that seems sort of hopeless. You know, this isn't the right guy to write a story about hope. But he was actually perfect because hope was exactly what he needed at that time. So he started working very hard on creating this story about hope. So he was inspired by Santa's reindeer, of course, and he actually got to see reindeer at the zoo when he would take his little daughter there, because she was still very little at the time and she loved to go to the zoo to see the reindeer. So reindeers have black noses, so where did he get the idea for a bright shiny red nose? You may be wondering that. Well, he worked in Chicago, which was very foggy, and so looking out in the fog one day he thought, wait a minute, what if Santa had to drive through that? He'd need a bright shining light to help him out. And so that's how he came up with the idea for the story. So about 10 years later, after the storybook came out, Robert L. May's brother-in-law, whose name was Johnny Marks, who was a great songwriter, made the story into a song. And Gene Autry, who at the time was famous for starring in singing cowboy movies, where he played a singing cowboy who would get the girl and save the day from the bad guy. He was famous for singing some Christmas songs too, like Here Comes Santa Claus and Santa Claus is Coming to Town, Up on the Housetop, Frosty the Snowman. And he took the song Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and made it a #1 hit when he sang it. And so that's how it became such a popular hit, and it's still a popular hit today. So if you want to see the library's version of We Wish You a Merry Christmas, or a version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer with some slightly different lyrics that someone you know may have written, then I suggest you go check out the Grumpy Librarian Storytime on our YouTube page. Until next time, goodbye and have a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.